By 1943, the German High Command was no longer looking for a simple tank. They were obsessed with creating an absolute psychological weapon that would symbolize the unstoppable power of the Third Reich. The Tiger II, officially known as the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf, and nicknamed the King Tiger, was the result of this desperate engineering hubris. It was designed to be the definitive heavy tank, a machine that combined the impenetrable armor of the earlier Tiger with the superior sloped design of the Panther. The goal was to create a predator that could eliminate any Allied or Soviet vehicle long before they even got within firing range. The heart of the King Tiger's lethality was its legendary 88mm KWK 43L/71 main gun. This was not just a minor upgrade over the original Tiger's cannon, it was arguably the finest anti-tank gun of the entire war. With a barrel length of over 6 meters, it could propel an armor-piercing shell at such a high velocity that it could punch through the front of a Soviet IS-2 or an American Pershing from over 2 kilometers away. For Allied tankers, the sight of that long, menacing barrel on the horizon was a death sentence, as the King Tiger could effectively engage targets with surgical precision from a distance where they were practically invisible. To protect this massive weapon, the Germans wrapped the King Tiger in an incredible amount of steel. The front hull featured 150mm of armor, sloped at 50 degrees, which made it functionally invulnerable to any Allied tank gun in a head-on engagement. Even the most powerful anti-tank shells of the era would simply spark and ricochet off its massive frontal plate. This protection gave the German crews a dangerous sense of invincibility, allowing them to sit in open fields and pick off entire enemy platoons while the return fire did little more than scratch the paint of their iron beast. However, this level of protection and firepower came at a staggering physical cost. The King Tiger weighed 68 tons. It was a massive, lumbering behemoth that pushed the absolute limits of World War II technology. To move this much steel, the Germans used the same 700 horsepower Maybach engine that powered the much lighter Tiger I and Panther. This meant the King Tiger was chronically underpowered, putting immense strain on its transmission and final drives. The tank wasn't just heavy, it was a mechanical time bomb, where every mile driven brought it closer to a catastrophic internal collapse. The manufacturing of the King Tiger was a display of German craftsmanship at its most impractical. Every tank was a complex maze of high-grade components that required a massive amount of skilled labor and rare strategic materials. Because of the constant Allied bombing of German factories and the increasing scarcity of materials like chromium and molybdenum, the quality of the steel in later models began to decline. Despite its terrifying appearance, the late-war King Tigers were prone to cracking under the impact of heavy shells, a hidden flaw that proved even the most formidable armor had its limits when an empire was crumbling. Only 489 King Tigers were ever produced, a drop in the ocean compared to the tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s rolling off Allied assembly lines. The King Tiger was the ultimate boutique weapon, a masterpiece of over-engineering that was far too expensive and complex for a war of attrition. Every single unit lost was an irreplaceable blow to the German armored force. It was a machine built for a war of myths and legends, but it was being forced to fight a war of logistics and industrial numbers that it simply could not win. Behind the terrifying silhouette of the King Tiger lay a logistical nightmare that often did more damage to the German army than enemy shells. The 68-ton weight of the tank made it a prisoner of the European landscape. Most bridges were incapable of supporting its mass, and narrow village streets became impassable traps for the wide, heavy machine. To move a King Tiger any significant distance, the Germans had to rely on specialized railway wagons, but the Allied air superiority meant that these trains were often destroyed long before they reached the front, leaving the tanks stranded hundreds of miles from the battle. If a King Tiger managed to reach the battlefield, its own mechanical fragility became the next enemy. The transmission was the tank's greatest weakness, as it was never truly designed to handle the immense torque required to move 68 tons of steel. Driving the tank required a level of finesse and skill that many young, inexperienced crews simply didn't have. A single sharp turn in soft mud or a sudden gear change could snap the drive shafts or shred the internal gears, turning the world's most powerful tank into a stationary, multi-million-dollar bunker that couldn't move its own turret. Maintenance in the field was an exercise in frustration and exhaustion. Because of the tank's complex interleaved road wheel system, a design carried over from the original Tiger, changing a single damaged internal wheel required removing several other wheels first. This could take a crew and a repair team an entire day of grueling labor. In a retreat, there was no time for such work. Thousands of King Tiger maintenance hours were wasted on basic repairs, and it was common for German units to have only a fraction of their tanks operational at any given time, with the rest stuck in repair shops waiting for spare parts that never arrived. Fuel consumption was the King Tiger's Achilles heel. The massive Maybach engine was notoriously thirsty, devouring petrol at a rate that was staggering even for a heavy tank. In cross-country conditions, a King Tiger could empty its massive fuel tanks in just a few dozen miles. By 1944, Germany was suffocating from a lack of oil, and the King Tiger's hunger for fuel became a strategic liability. There are countless reports of King Tigers being abandoned by their crews in perfect working order, simply because the supply trucks had been destroyed or the fuel depots were empty. The recovery of a disabled King Tiger was nearly impossible without specialized equipment. It took 2 or even 3 heavy Bergpanther recovery vehicles linked together just to tow one stalled King Tiger. If a tank got stuck in deep mud or suffered a mechanical failure under fire, it was almost always lost. German doctrine eventually required crews to destroy their own tanks with explosive charges rather than let them fall into enemy hands. This led to a tragic irony. The Germans destroyed more of their own King Tigers than the Allies ever did in actual tank-on-tank combat. Ultimately, the King Tiger was a victim of its own ambition. It was a machine that required a perfect world, perfect roads, unlimited fuel, and expert mechanics to function at its full potential. But the reality of 1944 and 1945 was one of chaos, retreat, and industrial collapse. The King Tiger was a high-performance race car forced to compete in a demolition derby. Its terrifying power was real, but its inability to stay in the fight made it a magnificent, expensive failure that drained the last remaining strength of the Third Reich's panzer divisions. When the King Tiger first appeared on the battlefields of Europe in the summer of 1944, it created a wave of genuine terror among Allied and Soviet crews. Its combat debut took place on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Sandomier's bridgehead, and shortly after, it faced the Western Allies in Normandy. The sheer scale of the tank meant that any engagement began on the King Tiger's terms. It could sit in a concealed position and pick off T-34s or Shermans from distances where the enemy couldn't even see what was hitting them. In these early encounters, the King Tiger proved that in a long-range duel, it was the undisputed master of the world, a predator that had no equal in raw striking power. The most famous deployment of the King Tiger came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Elite units like the SS 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion were equipped with these monsters to lead the spearhead through the Ardennes forest. The sight of these massive tanks clanking through the narrow, snowy mountain roads was enough to break the morale of many inexperienced American units. The King Tiger was the iron fist of Hitler's last gamble, designed to smash through the Allied lines and drive all the way to Antwerp. In the close-quarters fighting of the Ardennes, the King Tiger's thick armor made it a terrifying obstacle that required massive artillery strikes or daring flank attacks to neutralize. However, the terrain of the Ardennes quickly revealed the King Tiger's fatal flaws. The narrow, winding roads and weak bridges of the Belgian countryside were never meant for a 68-ton machine. Massive traffic jams were created as King Tigers broke down or got stuck, blocking the entire German advance. The famous Kampfgruppe, leading the offensive, had to abandon many of their heaviest tanks simply because they couldn't negotiate the tight turns or ran out of fuel in the deep snow. The King was a giant in a cage, unable to use its speed or maneuverability in a landscape that fought back as much as the American soldiers did. On the Eastern Front, the King Tiger faced an even more dangerous opponent, the Soviet IS-2 Stalin tank. These encounters were some of the most violent tank battles in history. Unlike the Western Allies, the Soviets had heavy 122mm guns that could actually threaten the King Tiger at medium ranges. While the German 88mm gun was more accurate, the Soviet shells carried massive kinetic energy that could crack the King Tiger's armor plates or knock the turret off its ring even without a direct penetration. It was a clash of titans where the King Tiger had to rely on its superior optics and long-range accuracy to survive, as any mistake would result in total annihilation. Despite their legendary status, the King Tiger units were constantly plagued by a lack of coordination and air cover. By 1945, the Allied and Soviet air forces owned the skies. A King Tiger was a massive, slow-moving target for Hawker Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts carrying rockets and heavy bombs. No matter how thick the side armor was, the thin roof of the tank was vulnerable. German crews often spent more time hiding their tanks under trees and camouflage nets than actually fighting, as a single spotter plane could call down a storm of fire that not even the king of tanks could survive. In the final months of the war, King Tigers were used as mobile fire brigades, rushed from one collapsing front to another to plug gaps in the line. They fought desperate rearguard actions in Hungary and outside Berlin, often destroying dozens of enemy tanks in a single day. But these victories were meaningless in the face of the overwhelming numbers of the Red Army and the Western Allies. Every King Tiger destroyed was a monument to a lost cause, a final, defiant roar from a machine that was built to rule a 1,000-year Reich but instead found itself fighting for survival in the ruins of its own capital. The end of the King Tiger was rarely heroic. As the Third Reich collapsed, the majority of these massive tanks didn't fall to enemy shells, but to the desperate reality of a lost war. Thousands of tons of German steel were abandoned on the roads of Germany, Poland, and Austria. Crews, running out of fuel or facing a simple mechanical breakdown that couldn't be fixed, were forced to use explosive charges to blow up their own machines. It is a staggering historical fact that more King Tigers were destroyed by their own crews than by Allied or Soviet tanks. The invincible King was defeated by empty fuel cans and snapped drive shafts, a pathetic end for the most powerful machine of its time. When the Allied and Soviet engineers finally got their hands on intact King Tigers at the end of the war, their reactions were a mix of awe and dismissiveness. They marveled at the incredible 88mm gun and the sheer quality of the optical sights, which were far ahead of anything the Allies possessed. However, they were also horrified by the tank's impracticality. Soviet testers noted that the engine was chronically overloaded and the fuel consumption made it a strategic disaster. The Americans, after testing the tank at Aberdeen Proving Ground, concluded that while it was a formidable defensive weapon, it was far too heavy and unreliable for the type of mobile, offensive warfare that defined the modern era. The legacy of the King Tiger is one of what-if and engineering hubris. It represents the peak of the German philosophy of quality over quantity, a philosophy that ultimately lost them the war. If the resources used to build 489 King Tigers had been spent on thousands of more reliable Panther tanks or anti-tank guns, the war might have lasted longer. But the King Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a propaganda tool, a symbol of Hitler's belief that a superior machine could overcome the industrial might of the rest of the world. It was a magnificent failure that drained Germany of its last strategic materials in pursuit of a dream of iron invincibility. Interestingly, the design of the King Tiger had very little influence on the future of tank development. After the war, the world superpowers moved away from the super-heavy concept. They realized that a 70-ton tank was a logistical nightmare that couldn't be easily transported or maintained. The future belonged to the main battle tank, machines like the British Centurion or the Soviet T-54, which balanced armor, firepower, and mobility in a 40 to 50-ton package. The King Tiger was an evolutionary dead end, a massive dinosaur that couldn't survive in a world where speed and reliability were becoming more important than raw armor thickness. Today, only a handful of King Tigers survive in museums around the world, such as Bovington in the UK, Saumur in France, and Kubinka in Russia. Standing next to one of these surviving giants, you can still feel the immense presence and the aura of terror it once projected. Even in silence, the King Tiger looks dangerous. It remains the ultimate icon for military history enthusiasts, a machine that represents the extreme limits of what industrial technology could achieve in the 1940s. It is a piece of history that continues to fascinate because it sits at the intersection of terrifying power and absolute impracticality. In the final analysis, the King Tiger was a tank that won almost every battle it entered, but helped lose the war. It was a predator that could destroy anything it could see, but it couldn't see the industrial reality that was crushing it. It was a masterpiece of steel and fire, a king without a kingdom, fighting a war of numbers that it could never understand. The King Tiger remains a haunting reminder that in the theater of war, pure strength is nothing without the ability to stay in the fight. It was the most powerful tank of World War II, but its own weight was the crown that finally broke its back.